There is a question that serious people in the art world have been carefully avoiding for decades, because it is the kind of question that makes everyone at the dinner table go slightly quiet and reach for more wine. What happens to art when the person making it is fundamentally unbothered by the suffering of other human beings? What does creativity look like when it grows in soil that contains everything except empathy? The answer, it turns out, is great art. The psychopathic mind, specifically structured, specifically oriented toward the world in measurable ways, produces art that carries the fingerprints of that specific structure. The art is shaped by the psychology that made it, the way a river is shaped by the geology it runs through. And once you learn to see those fingerprints, you see them everywhere. And some of the most celebrated works in human cultural history start to look slightly different. Before we get into the art, we need to spend time with the psychology, because the popular understanding of psychopathy is so saturated with movie serial killers and dramatic courtroom reveals that the actual clinical reality has been almost completely buried under the entertainment version. The entertainment version is useless for understanding artists. The clinical reality is genuinely illuminating. Psychopathy, as the researchers who study it most carefully understand it, is a specific constellation of traits that cluster together with remarkable consistency. The centerpiece is a particular relationship to emotion, specifically to other people's emotions. The psychopathic brain processes the emotional states of other people as information rather than as experience. If you watch someone stub their toe and you are neurotypical, something happens in your body. A flinch, a wince, a minor echo of the pain. This is called affective empathy, and it is largely automatic, largely involuntary, largely happening below the level of conscious decision. The psychopathic brain produces this echo very faintly, or, in the more extreme cases, essentially as a flicker of pure data. What the psychopathic brain does produce in abundance is something researchers call cognitive empathy. The capacity to accurately model what other people are feeling and thinking and wanting, without feeling it oneself. This is actually a sophisticated skill. It requires close observation, strong pattern recognition, the ability to hold a mental model of another consciousness separate from one's own. Psychopaths are, on average, extraordinary readers of people. They can tell you exactly what someone is feeling. They simply do the reading from the outside. Add to this a particular relationship to fear, specifically the relative absence of it in the form that most people experience it. The threat response in the psychopathic nervous system is calibrated differently, producing a person who experiences danger and uncertainty as interesting rather than aversive, who can hold steady in situations that would overwhelm most people with anxiety, who can pursue long-term objectives across conditions of high uncertainty without the emotional turbulence that derails more fear-sensitive individuals. Take fearlessness. Add cognitive sophistication. Add the absence of the emotional noise that most people's decision-making generates, and you have a very specific kind of mind. One that sees the world with unusual clarity in certain directions, while being essentially blind in others. And this specific configuration of clarity and blindness produces art that is, in its best and worst moments, unlike anything else in human culture. Here is the uncomfortable insight at the center of this whole discussion. The one that serious art criticism has been dancing around for a very long time. A certain kind of artistic power requires a relationship to other people that is closer to the psychopathic end of the spectrum than most of us are comfortable acknowledging. The ability to look at a human being, a real, suffering, hoping, fearing, loving human being, and see them primarily as a formal problem, as raw material for composition, as an element in a structure, as something to be used in the service of the work. This ability produces art of a specific and powerful kind. It produces art that uses human material with a ruthless, formal intelligence that more empathetically wired artists often struggle to access because they are too busy feeling. The great portrait painters, who could capture something true and devastating about their subjects, were often, in their personal lives, described as cold. Incurious about others' well-being, using people, moving on without looking back. The great novelists, who could anatomize human psychology with surgical precision, who could describe cruelty from the inside, with a completeness that made readers feel they were reading their own darkest thoughts, were often people who treated their actual intimates with a clinical detachment that left a trail of damage. This is deeply uncomfortable to sit with. It requires holding two things simultaneously. The art is genuinely illuminating about human experience, and the person who made it may have been oriented toward human experience in a way that most of us would recognize as clinically disordered. Both things are true. The discomfort of holding them both is real information about something genuinely complex. Let's get specific, because specificity is where this conversation stops being abstract and starts being revelatory. Francis Bacon painted human figures that look like they are being processed by grief, by desire, by time, by the sheer physical indignity of existing in a body. The figures in his paintings are caught in states that conventional representation would sanitize or avoid, convulsing, dissolving, merging with their furniture, screaming in ways that suggest the scream is structural rather than reactive, as if the figure's whole purpose is to be a container for that particular intensity of sound. Bacon himself was, by every account of everyone who knew him, one of the most charismatic and most ruthless people in 20th century London. He was a gambler, a drinker, a man who moved through relationships with the consuming attention of someone who finds people infinitely interesting as long as they remain usable, and the complete indifference of someone for whom the concept of loyalty is basically theoretical. He was also capable of extraordinary generosity, erratic, unpredictable generosity that arrived without explanation and departed without warning, which is itself a very specific psychological signature. What Bacon's paintings reveal about the psychopathic aesthetic is something specific. The body rendered as pure sensation without the protective mediation of sentiment. When a neurotypical painter paints a human figure in extremis, there is almost always something in the image that reaches toward comfort. A compositional gesture, a quality of light, something that frames the suffering within a larger order that makes it bearable. Bacon's paintings refuse this gesture. The figures suffer without framework. The paint around them offers nothing. The space they occupy is simply indifferent, which is far more disturbing than hostility would be. This indifference in the image is almost certainly related to an indifference in the painter. Constitutional indifference, the specific quality of a consciousness that experiences the world's pain as spectacle rather than as demand. And the result is paintings that are among the most honest representations of human suffering in the Western tradition, precisely because they refuse the consolation that most representations of suffering offer. The psychopathic eye sees suffering whole because it stays open, all the way, without flinching. Go back 4 centuries and you find Caravaggio, who solved every formal problem he ever encountered with the same instrument. Raw, unmediated physical reality pushed so close to the viewer's face that the conventional distance between art and life essentially collapses. His figures bleed. They strain. They have dirty fingernails. The light he used was unlike anything in the Western tradition at that point. A darkness so total that the illuminated figures seemed to emerge from nothing, as if existence itself were in the process of being decided. Caravaggio was also a man who killed someone in a street fight and fled Rome under a papal death sentence, who throughout his life moved through violence with a casualness that his contemporaries found alarming and his biographers have found endlessly fascinating. He picked fights, he wounded people, he treated the consequences of violence, including his own, with a pragmatism that suggests the normal emotional register of violent acts simply did not activate in him the way it activated in the people around him. The violence in Caravaggio's life and the violence in his art are related. but the relationship is subtle. His art does something specific with physical suffering that the religious painting tradition he was working in had always stopped short of. It makes the suffering feel real in the body of the viewer. A Caravaggio decapitation, and he painted several because of course he did, produces a physical response in the person looking at it. Something tightens, something in the gut responds. The representation reaches past the eye directly into the nervous system. This quality, the capacity to produce physical sensation through visual representation, is one of the signatures of the psychopathic aesthetic sensibility. The painter who achieves it is working from direct, unmediated knowledge of what physical extremity looks like and how the body holds itself under conditions of violence or terror or ecstasy. The painter who has normal fear responses has to work harder, has to imagine more carefully, has to reconstruct through effort what the psychopathically low-fear individual has simply observed with the flat, comprehensive attention that comes from looking without being frightened of what you're looking at. Caravaggio looked at everything with the same unblinking steadiness, and his paintings have the quality of that steadiness, a completeness of attention, a refusal to look away from the thing that produces art of almost unbearable physical presence. Once you know what to look for, you start seeing it everywhere, and it ranges from the merely suggestive to the clinically obvious. The pattern is particular kind of artistic power that correlates with particular psychological configuration, and it appears with enough consistency across enough different artists and periods to demand a more serious account than it usually receives. There is the formal boldness, the willingness to make moves in the work that most artists hesitate over, because the moves require a certain ruthlessness toward conventional expectation, toward what the viewer wants, toward the inherited rules of the medium. The psychopathically bold artist makes these moves with a confidence that others read, retrospectively, as genius, but that in the moment of making is essentially a function of low inhibition combined with strong, formal intelligence. They are following the logic of the work, rather than the social contract of making work that meets people where they are. There is the specific quality of observation, the way certain artists seem to have X-ray vision into human motivation, human weakness, human self-deception. They can show you a person more fully than the person shows themselves, because they are reading behavior with the cognitive precision of someone for whom other people are fascinating puzzles rather than moral presences. The novelist who creates characters so psychologically complete that readers recognize themselves in the darkest ones, this novelist very often has the specific capacity to observe human behavior from the outside, with a completeness that emotional involvement would compromise. There is the appetite for transgression, the consistent interest in subject matter that other artists approach cautiously or avoid entirely. The body in its most extreme states, power in its most naked exercise. The mechanisms of cruelty, rendered with the completeness that only comes from finding them genuinely interesting. This is the aesthetic signature of someone drawn toward the edges of human experience, because those edges are where the most intense information lives. And intensity of information is what a certain kind of mind finds most alive. The self-portrait is one of the most revealing documents an artist can produce, and the self-portraits made by artists with psychopathic traits have a specific quality that, once recognized, becomes unmistakable. They share an unusual relationship to vanity, an orientation that is simultaneously intensely interested in the self and essentially indifferent to how the self is perceived by others. Ordinary vanity wants to look good. The psychopathic self-portrait wants to look accurate, and it pursues accuracy in directions that most vanity would refuse. There is a long tradition of self-portraits that show the artist in states of decomposition, of grotesque expression, of physical extremity, of deliberate ugliness pushed well past what normal self-presentation would allow. These paintings have the quality of self-observation rather than self-presentation, the artist regarding themselves as a specimen rather than as a person, finding their own face as interesting and as available for ruthless formal use as any other face they have painted. This is psychopathically inflected self-perception, high in self-interest, essentially indifferent to self-image in the social sense. The person who can paint themselves as a skull, as a body in decay, as a figure in anguish, with the same steady hand they would bring to any other formal problem. This person has a relationship to their own selfhood that sits unusually close to their relationship to everyone else. Which is to say, informative, but emotionally unbinding. There is a category of art that was literally made in conditions of violence. Made by people whose psychological relationship to violence gave them access to material that other artists could approach only through imagination. And this art has a quality that no amount of research or deliberate transgression can fully replicate, because the access is real rather than constructed. The war paintings made by people who move through combat with a quality of attention that the traumatized and the frightened cannot sustain. The figure work that comes from people who have been in rooms where terrible things happened and retained the capacity to look steadily at what was in those rooms rather than flinching into the protective blur of traumatic processing. What this art offers is a specific kind of witness. The witness of a consciousness that can hold reality fully in view under conditions where most consciousness goes into protective override. This is one of the functions that the psychopathic sensibility serves in culture, however uncomfortable it is to acknowledge. The person who can remain fully present to extremity, who can observe and record without the self-protective shutdowns that preserve most people's sanity, produces documents of human experience that are otherwise inaccessible. This does not make the psychology admirable. It makes it interesting. The two things are fully separable, which is itself a slightly psychopathic observation. And perhaps that tells you something about the position this kind of art puts the viewer in. It asks you, at least temporarily, to separate the quality of the information from the quality of the source. Brief, but real. Here is a dimension of this story that almost never gets discussed, and it deserves its own section because it is genuinely strange. The specific enthusiasm with which certain collectors pursue art made by people who have committed violent crimes. Serial killer art is a real market. John Wayne Gacy painted clowns in prison, and those paintings sell for substantial sums. Charles Manson made music that still circulates. Ted Bundy sketched. The work is, almost uniformly, modest in technical skill and devoid of formal innovation. And yet people pay. People display. The question of what is being purchased here is genuinely interesting. The collector is clearly buying something beyond the aesthetic object, because the aesthetic object alone would justify approximately zero of the price. They are buying proximity to an extreme, to a consciousness that operated outside the boundaries of what most human beings can imagine, let alone inhabit. There is a kind of dark tourism in it, the desire to get as close as possible to the thing you find most terrifying and most alien, safely. But there is also something that the serious collectors of this material sometimes articulate with surprising clarity. The work carries a specific energy that comes from having been made by a hand that also did the other things. The provenance is inside the object. The knowledge of who made it and what else they did changes how the marks on the canvas look. In the same way that knowing a sentence was written by someone in a state of extreme experience changes how you read the syntax. Context bleeds into perception. You cannot stop it from happening. Now let's do the uncomfortable thing and turn the lens around. Because any serious discussion of this topic eventually has to reckon with something the academic art world has been sitting with very awkwardly. The possibility that what draws audiences to certain kinds of powerful, transgressive, extreme art is something in the audience that rhymes with something in the artist. The psychopath finds other people's suffering interesting rather than painful. The audience that finds Bacon's figures compelling, that returns to Caravaggio's violence, that reads the most brutal passages of certain novels with the specific quality of attention that distinguishes fascination from horror, this audience is also, temporarily, in a mode of relating to represented suffering that is closer to interesting than painful. The representation provides a frame that allows the affective empathy to be suspended in the service of aesthetic engagement. This suspension is one of the fundamental mechanisms of art, and it is usually understood as a feature rather than a problem. The capacity to engage with tragedy without being destroyed by it, to witness extremity within the protective frame of the aesthetic, to process the full range of human experience at a remove that makes processing possible. This is what art has always offered. But the psychopathic dimension of this experience is worth naming. The aesthetic frame produces, temporarily, something like the psychopathic relationship to the world's pain. It makes suffering observable. It makes extremity bearable. It makes the otherwise overwhelming into something you can look at steadily and learn from. The audience of transgressive art is using art to access a mode of perception that the artist accessed constitutionally. Which is an interesting sentence to sit with. Here is one of the most genuinely strange phenomena in this territory. The art that is more emotionally intelligent than the person who made it. The novel that anatomizes grief with aching accuracy, written by someone who in real life moved through other people's grief with the empathetic engagement of a tax accountant. The painting that makes viewers feel seen in their loneliness, made by someone who experienced loneliness only as a logistical condition. The film that produces in its audience a recognition of human connection so precise that it functions almost as therapy, directed by someone whose actual relationships were characterized by systematic exploitation. This happens because artistic intelligence and emotional intelligence are genuinely different capacities, drawing on different resources. The artistic intelligence that produces great work draws on observation, on pattern recognition, on the capacity to construct models of human experience that are accurate and complete. This capacity draws on modeling, rather than on feeling. The psychopathic artist has the modeling capacity in abundance. They have spent their lives observing other people with the close, detached, comprehensive attention of someone who is always reading the room from outside it emotionally. They have built extraordinarily detailed models of how human beings think and feel, and want and fear, because understanding other people has always been, for them, a practical project. And those models, when applied to the construction of art, produce representations of human experience that can be more accurate, more complete, more honest than what a more emotionally involved artist would produce. The paradox is tight. The person least capable of feeling certain human experiences may be, in specific circumstances, the most capable of representing them. Because representation is a cognitive act, and experience is an emotional one, and the psychopathic mind has traded one for the other in a transaction that is, from the perspective of artistic production, sometimes a very good deal. Psychopathy correlates strongly with a specific, interpersonal quality that researchers measure under the somewhat clinical label of superficial charm. But this label does the phenomenon a disservice because the charm is real, it functions, it produces genuine responses in the people it's directed at. The psychopathic individual has often spent decades calibrating their presentation to maximize their impact on others, reading reactions with exceptional precision and adjusting in real time. The result is a person who, in many social contexts, seems more present, more attentive, more magnetizing than anyone else in the room. This calibrated attention gets into the art in specific ways. There is a category of artistic work that produces in its audience the sensation of being seen, of being fully attended to by the work, of the artist having looked at exactly your particular experience and rendered it with specific accuracy. Great art often has this quality, but the art made by psychopathically configured artists sometimes has it in an unusual degree, because the artist's whole life has been an exercise in the precise modelling of other people's inner experience. The novel that makes you feel the author was inside your head. The painting that seems to have been made specifically for your particular relationship to the subject. The piece of music that locates something in your emotional life with a precision that feels almost violating. These pieces of art may owe their specific quality of felt recognition to a maker who was, in the actual conduct of their life, the least likely person to genuinely feel what you feel, but the most capable person to model it accurately and represent it back to you. There is a cumulative effect to sustained exposure to art made from the psychopathic sensibility And it is worth naming because it is real, and it is something the culture of art appreciation tends to step around very carefully. The effect is a gradual education in a particular mode of seeing, the mode that finds human experience interesting rather than demanding, that approaches suffering as information rather than as summons, that can hold the full complexity of what people do to each other and to themselves without collapsing into either sentiment or revulsion. This is genuinely useful. The capacity to look steadily at difficult human experience, to witness without turning away, to process complexity without forcing it into resolution, to find the formally interesting thing in what is also the morally terrible thing. This is one of the things that serious engagement with serious art develops, and the art that most forcefully develops it is often the art made from the specific mode of perception we have been exploring. You come out of sustained engagement with Bacon's paintings slightly reconfigured. You come out of Caravaggio's violence with a different relationship to your own nervous system's responses. The great transgressive novels leave you with a model of human psychological complexity that is more honest and more complete than the one you brought to them. All of this is growth. All of this is art doing what art does at its best. The source of that growth is sometimes a consciousness that would, in direct personal encounter, produce a very different response entirely. Alarm, discomfort, the specific feeling of being in a room with someone who is reading you with great precision, while feeling nothing for you at all. The art mediates. The art translates. The art takes what the psychopathic sensibility produces and packages it into something that can be absorbed by people whose emotional architecture is radically different from the maker's. Me. Here is what all of this adds up to, stated as directly as possible. Artistic genius and ethical goodness are different dimensions of human capacity. They develop independently, they can be maximally present and maximally absent in the same person simultaneously, and the art world's discomfort with this fact has caused it to either overcorrect toward the separate the art from the artist dismissal, or undercorrect toward the now that we know this person was terrible, the work is tainted revisionism, neither of which actually engages with the interesting thing. The interesting thing is the specific relationship between a particular psychological structure and a particular kind of artistic production. The interesting thing is that the psychopathic sensibility, the specific configuration of cognitive clarity, affective flatness, fearlessness, and interpersonal reading precision generates art with recognizable characteristics: the unflinching witness, the formal boldness, the X-ray vision into human motivation, the refusal of consolation, the representation of suffering that makes suffering feel real rather than framed. The interesting thing is that the audience's relationship to this art is more complicated than appreciation, because engaging with it requires temporarily inhabiting a mode of perception that is, for most people, genuinely foreign, and that this temporary inhabitation is part of what makes the engagement valuable. And the interesting thing, finally, is what this reveals about art itself, that it can carry genuine human insight across the widest possible gaps in human psychological experience, that it can take what a person without a conscience saw in the world and deliver it to a person full of conscience in a form that illuminates, that the empathy gap, which in direct human encounter produces exploitation and damage, becomes in the mediated space of the artwork a different kind of transaction entirely, one in which the viewer's full emotional apparatus engages with what the maker's emotional apparatus was structurally unable to generate, and the result is understanding. Art has always been this, the technology that makes different kinds of consciousness legible to each other. The psychopathic artist is just the extreme case that shows you the mechanism most clearly, precisely because the gap it bridges is the widest, and the bridging is therefore the most visible. Start with Bacon, sit with the discomfort. The discomfort is where the learning lives. Try actual generosity toward this psychological configuration. Real open-mindedness, the kind that goes past the polite acknowledgement of complexity and into something more like genuine admiration for what this way of being in the world makes possible. Because there are things that the psychopathically configured mind produces that the world genuinely, urgently needed, that the empathetically configured mind could not have produced, and that we walk around benefiting from every day without acknowledging the source. The psychopathic artist, at their best, gave humanity something extraordinary: permission. Permission to look at things that everyone was looking at anyway and pretending they weren't. Permission to say true things that the social contract had declared unsayable. Permission to find the world funny when it was being solemn, and solemn when it was being farcical. And to refuse the performance of appropriate feeling in favour of whatever the actual feeling was. Which is, 9 times out of 10, considerably more interesting. This is a gift, a real one. And the people who gave it were, often, the people whose constitutional indifference to social approval made them the only ones capable of giving it. Oscar Wilde walked into every room he ever entered as if he had specifically designed the room for the purpose of his entrance. And the world has been the richer for this posture ever since. He was a man of extraordinary wit, extraordinary vanity, extraordinary social intelligence, and a relationship to other people's feelings that was, in the clinical sense we have been developing, notably thin. He found people delightful as material. He found their sufferings and pretensions and hypocrisies endlessly amusing and endlessly useful. He harvested them for epigrams, the way a beekeeper harvests honey, with skilled, practiced, essentially impersonal efficiency. And the results were among the most perfectly constructed sentences in the English language. The specific gift of Wilde's psychopathic configuration was that it made him constitutionally immune to the thing that destroys most wit, the fear of giving offence. Genuine wit requires saying true things that the social contract has decided should remain unsaid. And this requires a specific relationship to the discomfort of the people you are being witty at. A relationship in which their discomfort registers but does not deflect. Wilde had this relationship completely. He could say, to a room full of people who were pretending not to notice something obviously true, the thing that was obviously true, in a sentence so well formed that the room laughed before it could decide to be offended. This is a psychopathic social move. It uses cognitive empathy, the precise reading of what people know and are pretending not to know, in the service of exposing the pretense, with the specific confidence of someone for whom the social cost of the exposure is genuinely not a deterrent. Wilde paid the social costs eventually, catastrophically, in ways that destroyed him. But he paid them with a kind of bewilderment that is itself revealing. The bewilderment of someone who understood intellectually that the rules existed, but had never fully internalized them as real constraints on his own behavior. The plays that resulted from this configuration are among the funniest things in the English theatrical tradition, and their funniness is inseparable from their truthfulness, and their truthfulness is inseparable from the specific quality of indifference that let Wilde say what everyone in the room was already thinking. He was the person who said out loud that the emperor's clothes were missing, and he said it in such perfect sentences that the emperor laughed too, briefly, before remembering to be furious. This is what the psychopathically configured wit does for culture. It services the gap between what people know and what they are allowed to say, and it does so with a freedom that the socially embedded, approval-seeking, consequences-aware person simply cannot access. The wit is a gift. The freedom is the gift. And the freedom was produced by exactly the psychological configuration we have been examining. Salvador Dali understood something that most artists never figure out. The persona is the work. The persona itself, constructed with the same deliberate, formal intelligence as any painting, maintained with the same obsessive attention to effect, performing with the same consistent logic. This is the work, and everything else is its documentation. Dali had moustaches that required maintenance and explanation. He had a pet ocelot. He carried a cane topped with an anteater skull. He said things in interviews that were formally structured nonsense, designed to produce maximum quotability while revealing minimum genuine content. He was surpassingly good at being Dali, and being Dali was a 24-hour performance that ran without interruption from the 1920s until he died in 1989. a performance so sustained and so perfectly calibrated that it eventually became unclear, to everyone, possibly including Dali, where the performance ended and the person began. The psychopathic dimension of this project is that it required, and in Dali's case possessed, a complete indifference to authentic self-expression. The psychopathic mind, constitutionally oriented toward the construction of managed presentations for external audiences, is extraordinarily well suited to the creation of a persona, because persona creation is exactly the skill that psychopathic social life demands and develops. You are always constructing the version of yourself that serves the current situation. Dali simply took this to its logical conclusion and made the construction his art form. The paintings are genuinely extraordinary, technically masterful, formally inventive, psychologically rich in ways that make them endlessly legible as representations of specific mental states. But the paintings are also, in a sense, props. They are what Dali painted while being Dali. The primary creative act was the sustained invention of a character so comprehensively realized, so specifically detailed, so committed to its own internal logic, that the world had to engage with it on its own terms. What Dali gave the art world, specifically, was the demonstration that the artist's public existence could be a formal creative act with the same claim on seriousness as any painting. He blew open the category of what an artist could do, expanded the medium to include the artist's own public life as raw material, and did so with a commitment and a craft that made the whole thing irresistible. Every artist who has since understood their public persona as a creative project, and there are many in every medium, is working in the space that Dali carved out with his moustaches and his ocelot, and his perfectly timed, outrageous statements. This is an enormous gift to culture, and it was made possible by the specific psychological configuration of someone for whom the authentic self was never a fixed point to be expressed, but a construction to be designed. Architecture is the art form that most directly affects the most people with the least consent. You do not choose to be in a city. You do not choose the buildings that define the visual field of your daily life, the spatial experience of your commute, the relationship between the human body and its built environment, that structures how you feel simply by existing in the world. Architecture does things to you, whether you asked it to or not. And this quality, the imposition of a vision on an entire population without requiring their agreement, is one of the things that makes architecture the perfect medium for the psychopathically ambitious mind. Le Corbusier wanted to redesign Paris. He had a plan, the Plan Voisin, developed in 1925, that involved demolishing most of central Paris and replacing it with a grid of uniform cruciform towers set in parkland, with elevated highways running between them. He presented this plan with the confidence of someone who had looked at the problem of urban life with complete formal clarity and arrived at the obviously correct solution, and who was somewhat puzzled by the resistance of people who presumably also wanted to live well, but seemed inexplicably attached to their existing neighbourhood. The plan was rejected. Paris survived. But what is interesting about Le Corbusier's urban vision is not its outcome but its internal logic, because the logic is extraordinarily coherent. He was attending to the city as a system, the distribution of light and air and movement across a dense human population, with the same clarity of attention that Bacon brought to the formal problem of the screaming face. The human histories embedded in every street were data in the system, and systems, elegantly solved, supersede their data. The buildings he actually built, the Villa Savoie, the Unité d'Habitation, Chandigarh, are among the most formally influential structures of the 20th century, and they share a specific quality that the people who live in them have described with varying degrees of enthusiasm. They are organised according to the architect's vision of how human beings should inhabit space, with the vision preceding the inhabitants and expecting them to rise to meet it. They make demands. They impose a specific way of being in space. They are generous in their formal ambition and constitutionally indifferent to individual comfort. This is the psychopathic built environment. Visionary at the macro scale, impersonal at the human scale, organized around a formal idea of how life should be lived that is internally coherent and externally uncompromising. And the extraordinary thing is that these spaces, for all their imperviousness to ordinary human need, produce in the people who inhabit them something real, an experience of space and light and proportion that is genuinely unlike anything the more negotiated, more accommodating, more comfort-oriented building provides. They are demanding, and they produce, in exchange for the demand, an experience of spatial quality that the comfortable building cannot access. This is the architectural expression of exactly what we have been finding in the paintings. The refusal to comfort produces an encounter with something real. The imposition of a formal vision produces a spatial experience unavailable through any gentler means. You have to live inside the vision to know what the vision knows. And the vision, for all its indifference to you personally, knows things worth knowing. Here is a thing about artistic courage that nobody talks about honestly. Most of what looks like brave, transgressive, boundary-pushing art was made by people who were frightened the entire time and pushed through the fear because they cared more about the work than about the reaction. This is real courage, genuine and admirable and exhausting, and the source of most of the best art in history. But there is another category, the work made by people who were simply constitutionally unbothered by what anyone thought. People for whom the fear was genuinely absent, who made extreme, uncomfortable, formally radical work with the same psychic investment they brought to making lunch. And this category of artistic production has a specific quality that courage-based transgression lacks. It is relaxed. There is no strain in it. The move that cost the courageous artist everything they had to produce is made by the psychopathically configured artist with the ease of someone performing a habitual action. This relaxation is visible in the work. The mark made without anxiety about its reception has a different quality from the mark made in the teeth of fear about what the mark will mean to people. The anxious mark is tighter, more defended, more self-conscious in ways that show. The relaxed mark, the mark of the artist who genuinely does not care about your opinion of the mark, while caring absolutely about the formal quality of the mark itself, has an openness that the most technically accomplished anxious mark cannot achieve. Think about the jazz musicians who played things that alienated most of their existing audience, who took music into territory that produced genuine hostility from people who had loved what they did before. The courage reading of this move is inspiring. They sacrificed popularity for artistic integrity. They followed the music wherever it went, regardless of the personal cost. The psychopathic reading is different, and in some cases equally true. They followed the music because the music was interesting, and the audience's reaction was genuinely, constitutionally not the primary factor in the decision. The indifference was real. The freedom it produced was real. The music it made possible was real. The gift to culture is this: the work made by people for whom approval is genuinely irrelevant establishes the outer limit of what art can be. It defines the edge. And once the edge is defined, everyone else, the courageous artists, the formally adventurous artists, the artists who care deeply about what you think, but also care about doing something new, has a map. The psychopathically produced extreme work functions as a kind of scout, reporting back from territory that the rest of the artistic community can then approach, more slowly and more carefully, now that someone has demonstrated it is inhabitable. Here is a game worth playing. Trace your favourite work of art backward through its influences and see how quickly you arrive at something made by someone whose personal biography makes your skin crawl. The game tends to resolve fast. Most serious art is in close genealogical relationship with work made by people whose relationship to other human beings was, to put it gently, complicated. This is because artistic influence works through permission. When you see something that was impossible before, a door opens in your own creative imagination. The door marked "This is now allowed," and you walk through it. The person who opened the door did so by being constitutionally indifferent to the question of whether the door was allowed to be opened, and their indifference translated into a painting, or a film, or a building, or a piece of music, became the permission that every subsequent artist in that lineage has been working with.
You like certain films. Those films exist because directors studied earlier films that pushed against what film was allowed to be. Those earlier films exist because someone, somewhere in the chain, made something that the people around them found disturbing or wrong or formally incoherent, and kept making it anyway because their relationship to the disturbance of the people around them was essentially clinical. Their indifference is in your favourite film. Their specific psychological configuration is in every frame of it. The film is, in this specific sense, a gift from a psychology that you would find alarming in person. This is one of the most interesting things about the relationship between psychopathy and art. The psychopathic artist's indifference to approval does not just produce their own work. It produces the conditions under which an enormous amount of subsequent work becomes possible. The opening of a door is a contribution that compounds over time, as everyone who walks through it opens more doors, none of which would have been accessible without the original act of opening. There is a specific kind of freedom that runs through the history of Western art like a current. A gradually expanding permission structure that allows each generation of artists to do things the previous generation could only approach cautiously. And the moments when this permission structure expands most dramatically are almost always the moments when someone with a psychopathically configured relationship to the opinions of others made something that redrew the boundary of what was possible. The artists who came after, the ones who were courageous in the conventional sense, who felt the fear and made the work anyway, were doing so in a space that the psychopathically indifferent artist had cleared. They were exploring territory that someone else had entered first, without equipment, without maps, without the protective gear of caring about the outcome. The fearless entry created the condition for the courageous entry. And the courageous entry, made by people with full emotional investment in both the work and its reception, produced the art that most of us actually love most. Because that art has the warmth of genuine human caring in it, alongside the formal freedom that the clearing made possible. The relationship is more symbiotic than we usually acknowledge. The psychopathic artist clears the ground. The emotionally invested artist builds something on the cleared ground that is both formally free and humanly warm. The audience receives a work that has inherited the formal liberation, without the emotional coldness of its origin. Nobody mentions where the land came from. The building looks great. Let's go back to Dali, because there is something specific about his practice that deserves more than the mustaches and ocelot treatment. In the late 1920s, Dali developed what he called the paranoia critical method, a systematic approach to generating images by deliberately cultivating and then observing the specific kind of pattern recognition overdrive that characterizes paranoid thinking. Paranoid cognition finds patterns everywhere. It sees faces in clouds, conspiracies in coincidences, hidden significance in arrangements that other people experience as random. This is usually understood as a pathology, the cognitive system producing false positives at an alarming rate, finding signal in noise, constructing meaning where meaning is absent. Dali understood it as a technique. He realized that the paranoid mode of perception, whatever its problems as a way of navigating daily life, was extraordinarily productive as a way of generating images, because it found connections between things that normative cognition keeps separate, because it populated the visual field with significance that composed naturally into surreal images of extreme psychological density. He cultivated this mode deliberately. He used it as a tool. The resulting method is one of the most genuinely innovative contributions to artistic practice in the 20th century. It produced the double images, the image that is simultaneously a face and the landscape, the figure that resolves into another figure when you look at it from a different distance, that remain among the most formally interesting things in the entire surrealist tradition. And it worked by treating a cognitive dysfunction as a creative resource. The psychopathic sensibility does something analogous. The specific ways in which the psychopathic mind departs from neurotypical cognitive and emotional norms are, in the art-making context, extraordinarily productive. The deficit of effective empathy is a resource for clear observation. The low fear response is a resource for formal boldness. The orientation toward cognitive modeling of other people is a resource for psychological accuracy in representation. Every feature of the configuration that makes it difficult as a way of being in social relationship is generative as a way of making art. This is the most open-minded possible way to understand what we have been examining. Psychopathy as a cognitive and perceptual toolkit that is, in the specific context of art making, genuinely advantageous. The toolkit is distributed into a population of human beings, and the people who receive it pay costs in their personal lives that are real and serious. But the art those costs fund is also real and serious, and humanity receives it and is changed by it and benefits from it without always acknowledging what went into the making.
The psychopathic artist made you freer.
Every time you look at a piece of art that shows you something true that you suspected but had never seen confirmed. Every time a film shows you the mechanism of a thing that everyone experiences and nobody names. Every time a painting makes the private visible. Every time a novel gives you the specific and complete account of an interior experience you thought was uniquely yours. You are receiving something that was made possible by a chain of artistic permission that runs, somewhere in its history, through the work of someone for whom other people's discomfort was genuinely not a deterrent. The freedom you have as a viewer. The freedom to encounter work that is formally radical, psychologically honest, willing to go to places that comfortable art avoids. This freedom was not given to you by the art world's institutions, who are constitutionally conservative. It was given to you by the artists who pushed against those institutions with the specific confidence of people who were not, at the deepest level, afraid of the institution's disapproval.
And that specific confidence in the cases we have been examining was constitution, the natural expression of a psychological configuration that produces, as a byproduct of its social difficulties, an artistic freedom that the more conventionally empathetic artists can only approximate. You benefit from this every time you experience art that is genuinely alive. The debt is real. The acknowledgement is long overdue. The people you owe it to were, many of them, genuinely difficult to be around. The difficulty and the gift came from the same place. And the gift, unlike the difficulty, is still here, in the museums, in the films, in the buildings, in the expanded sense of what art is allowed to be that every generation inherits from the one before. Go find the most uncomfortable thing in your nearest art museum and stand in front of it longer than you want to. You are collecting on a debt someone paid for you in a currency you wouldn't want to handle directly. The transaction is complete. The painting is yours. The freedom is yours. Use it.
Paul Gauguin is one of the most beloved painters in the Western tradition. His Tahitian paintings hang in the most prestigious museums in the world. They glow with colour and sensuality, and a quality of primal aliveness that makes people feel, standing in front of them, something like longing. The sense of a world of warmth and beauty, an uncomplicated physical existence that civilization has foreclosed. People have Gauguin prints in their homes. People name their children after places he painted. The paintings are rapturously beautiful.
Here is what actually happened in Tahiti.
Gauguin arrived in 1891, having already abandoned one wife and 5 children in Denmark, having run through several relationships in France, with the specific efficiency of someone for whom other people's emotional investment in him was a resource to be depleted. Having spent the previous decade oscillating between stockbroker, artist, and enthusiastic absent father,
with the pragmatic ease of someone for whom commitments are provisional by nature. In Tahiti, he took a 13-year-old girl as his common-law wife. Her name was Teha Amana. She was a child by any measure that matters, in a colonial context where her family's poverty and the asymmetry of power between a European man and a Polynesian girl meant that consent, in any meaningful sense, was a fiction. He painted her constantly. She appears in some of his most celebrated works, posed with the specific quality of absorbed attention that he brought to female subjects. Their bodies rendered with extraordinary formal sensitivity, their interiority left completely unaddressed, because their interiority was not what interested him. He later wrote about Teha Amana in a memoir with a quality of self-satisfied aestheticism that is, reading it now, one of the more genuinely stomach-turning documents in the history of Western art writing. He described their life together with the warm, proprietary tone of a man describing a particularly successful acquisition. He described her fear when she slept beside him in the dark, her not understanding what he was, her vulnerability, and he described these things as charming, as part of the atmosphere, as elements of an experience of primal authenticity that he was there to harvest. He gave syphilis to multiple Polynesian women during his years in the Pacific. He fathered children he left behind when he moved on. He spent his last years on another island, in legal trouble for encouraging the indigenous population to resist colonial taxation. Which sounds noble until you understand that he was primarily motivated by his own conflicts with the colonial administration, who he had annoyed by, among other things, soliciting their underage daughters. He died of syphilis in 1903. Now look at the paintings. The Tahitian women look out from the canvases with the specific quality of absorbed, self-contained presence that is one of Gauguin's great formal achievements. They occupy their bodies and their spaces with a wholeness that the Western painting tradition had almost never attributed to Polynesian subjects. The colour is extraordinary. The formal construction is extraordinarily sophisticated. The paintings are genuinely, completely beautiful, and the women in them had, in the majority of cases, no meaningful choice about being there. The specific beauty of the paintings, their quality of warmth, of physical abundance, of primal ease, was extracted from people who were in positions of profound structural vulnerability relative to the man with the brushes. The beauty is real. The extraction was real. The two things happened in the same place at the same time, and the first required the second, and sitting with this is not comfortable, and it is supposed to be not comfortable. The paintings know something about the people in them that the painter refused to know. The formal attention is genuine. The human indifference underneath it is genuine too. And the gap between them is the specific and terrible thing that makes Gauguin, if you look at him straight, one of the most genuinely instructive cases in this entire discussion. Egon Schiele was 22 years old when he was arrested in 1912 on charges that included seducing a minor and producing obscene art. He was held in custody for 24 days. During those 24 days, he produced a series of drawings in his cell, of himself in his cell, of his hands, of the wooden chair, of the experience of confinement, that are among the most formally extraordinary works he ever made. He burned one of his paintings in court as part of the proceedings. A judge held one of his works over a candle flame at the sentencing and said, "It is not art, it is pornography." And Schiele appears to have found this evaluation approximately as significant as a bad weather forecast. Schiele drew bodies the way a very precise instrument measures things, with complete fidelity to what was actually there, with zero adjustment for what the viewer might prefer to see instead. The bodies in his drawings are angular, exposed, sexually explicit in ways that were genuinely unprecedented in the European fine art tradition, posed in positions that have the quality of documentation rather than idealization. The people in his work are not arranged for beauty.
They are arranged for truth, which turns out to be a different thing entirely. More uncomfortable and more alive. He drew himself obsessively, and he drew himself with the same clinical honesty he brought to everyone else. Masturbating, contorted, naked and exposed in ways that men in the Western tradition essentially never depicted themselves. With all the vulnerability and strangeness, and specifically unglamorous physicality of an actual human body actually existing. He refused the self-mythologizing that male artists almost universally employed when depicting themselves. He looked at himself with the same flat, comprehensive attention he brought to everything else. And the drawings that resulted are some of the most honest self-portraits in the history of the medium. The charge of seducing a minor was never fully prosecuted. The more serious charges were dropped, and the historical record on exactly what happened is murky in the ways that historical records involving young women and powerful men tend to be murky. Which is to say that the murkiness is itself a kind of information. What is clear is that Sheila was constitutionally indifferent to the boundaries that governed what you were supposed to look at, supposed to draw, supposed to offer for public consumption. The work he made from this indifference is extraordinary. The indifference itself extended to people in his life in ways that caused real harm to real people, some of whom were in positions of real vulnerability relative to him. He died in 1918 at 28 of Spanish flu, 3 days after his pregnant wife died of the same. He had been drawing her during her illness. The last drawing he made of her is among the most devastatingly honest depictions of the body and extremity that exist in Western art. He drew her dying with the same complete, unmediated attention he had brought to everything else. The drawing is unbearable and perfect, and it is very hard to know what to do with the feeling of looking at it. Lucian Freud was the grandson of Sigmund Freud, which is the kind of biographical fact that seems almost too good to be true, but is true, and which the man himself appeared to find amusing when it was convenient, and irrelevant when it was not. He was born in Berlin in 1922, came to England as a child, became one of the most celebrated British painters of the 20th century, and died in 2011, leaving behind a body of work of extraordinary power and a wake of human complexity that his estate and the people who loved and hated him are still navigating. He had at least 14 children by various women, most of whom he never lived with, many of whom he saw infrequently, some of whom he cut off contact with for extended periods, for reasons that were, by the accounts of the people involved, either incomprehensible or very comprehensible in the specific way that the behaviour of someone who relates to other people primarily as sources of stimulation becomes comprehensible once you understand the organising principle. His relationships with his children were, across the board, organised according to his interest level rather than according to their need. When he was interested, he was apparently the most compelling person in the room. The full force of his attention, which was genuinely extraordinary, turned on a child or grandchild, produced an experience of being seen that people describe with a specific quality of intensity. When his interest moved on, which it did, the absence was total and unexplained, and left people who loved him in a state of confusion that some of them have spent decades processing. He painted people the way he related to them, with complete, consuming, almost predatory attention for exactly as long as they interested him. The painting sessions for his portraits lasted for months, sometimes years. The sitters described the experience of being painted by him as the most intimate and most disorienting experience of their lives. The sense of being looked at with a completeness that simultaneously honoured and objectified, that made you feel more fully real than you had been before, and also confirmed that you were, primarily, material. His paintings of his mother, made across multiple decades as she aged, are among the most devastating works in the series. They show the body aging with complete fidelity, the skin losing its tension, the flesh redistributing, the specific indignities of physical age rendered with the same unsentimental precision he brought to everything else.
his mother appears not to have enjoyed the experience of sitting for them. He painted her anyway, for years, with the serene certainty of someone for whom the importance of the work superseded whatever the subject felt about the process. The paintings are extraordinary. They are among the most honest representations of the aging body in Western art, and they carry something about the relationship between a son and a mother. The specific complexity of looking at your parent's body with the knowledge that your body came from this body, and this body is doing the thing your body will eventually do. That is almost too intimate to look at directly. All of this is in the work. The man who put it there was, by the evidence of how he conducted himself with the person in the paintings, operating with a quality of care that was formal rather than personal. The paintings care about his mother. He used his mother. Both of these things are true, and the distance between them is where the genuine strangeness of this particular kind of art-making lives. Balthazar Klasowski de Rolla, who painted as Balthus, spent his career making paintings of prepubescent and adolescent girls in states of semi-undress, in poses that combine the compositional formality of Renaissance painting with a quality of charged, unresolved tension that has only one honest description. He was celebrated by the most prestigious art institutions in the world. He had retrospectives at major museums. He was friends with heads of state. He lived to 92, dying in 2001, and received throughout his life a quality of institutional protection that reflected the art world's complex negotiation with the fact that his subject matter was what it was. In 2017, a petition was circulated asking the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to remove or contextualize one of his most famous paintings. The painting shows a young girl in a chair, her skirt arranged in a way that exposes her underwear, her posture suggesting either sleep or a kind of dreamy obliviousness to the viewer. The petition gathered thousands of signatures. The museum kept the painting up, added a label, and the debate produced more heat than resolution, which is appropriate because the question of what to do with this work is genuinely unresolvable by any procedure simpler than sitting with the discomfort until you understand what the discomfort is actually made of. Balthus always insisted that his work was about innocence, about a quality of unconscious grace in the young female body that Western culture had lost the capacity to perceive without projecting adult sexuality onto it. He said his critics were the ones with the dirty minds. This defense is, as defenses go, extraordinarily brazen. The kind of argument that requires its audience to doubt their own perception in favour of the artist's stated intention, which is a move that the psychopathically configured person makes with more confidence than anyone else, because the doubt of others is a resource, not a challenge. What the paintings actually show, what any honest description of their content produces, is the thing that the institutional art world spent decades finding increasingly sophisticated language to avoid saying directly. The evasion is itself a piece of the story. The fact that these paintings were in major museums, celebrated by serious critics, owned by serious collectors for decades. This is information about the art world's specific blind spots, and about the specific protection that formal excellence has historically provided to artists whose relationship to their subject matter deserved harder scrutiny than it received. The paintings are formally extraordinary. The compositional intelligence is real. The quality of light is real. The art historical references to Courbet, to Piero della Francesca, to the whole tradition of the figure in interior space are real and specific and demonstrating a genuine engagement with the history of the medium. And the subject matter is what it is, and the painter's relationship to that subject matter was what it was. And the institutions that displayed the work for decades were making choices about which realities to centre and which to keep in the peripheral vision. And all of this is the complete picture. There is a specific category of psychopathically configured painter that the art world has historically romanticized most enthusiastically: the violent drunk. The man whose biographical narrative includes bar fights, destroyed relationships, abandoned children, catastrophic financial decisions, and periodic intervals of transcendent creative production, all held together by the organizing substance of alcohol and the organizing narrative of tortured genius. This category is populated enough to constitute its own tradition, and the romanticization of it has done genuine damage, both to the people in the painters' lives who bore the costs of the behavior, and to subsequent generations of artists who absorbed the implicit message that this configuration of brilliant production and personal destruction was not only acceptable, but expected, even necessary. Jackson Pollock drove drunk into a tree in 1956, killing himself and one of 2 women in the car. The other woman survived with serious injuries. He was 44. He had spent the previous decade producing paintings that changed the history of the medium and relationships that changed the lives of the people in them in ways that ranged from complex to devastating. Lee Krasner, who was both his wife and a genuinely major painter in her own right, spent years managing his alcoholism, his rages, his infidelities, and his periodic creative crises, while her own career was consistently treated as secondary to his by the exact same critical apparatus that celebrated him. She continued to steward his legacy after his death with a dedication that the historical record suggests he had never brought to an equivalent degree to her. The paintings he made are extraordinary. The drip paintings, the technique that he developed and that is now so completely absorbed into the visual culture that it is hard to see how strange it was when he did it, are among the most physically immediate works in the history of the medium. The paint had to be applied in a specific state of body and concentration that, by accounts of people who watched him work, resembled a physical performance as much as a painting session. He was in the painting. The canvas was on the floor, and he moved around it, and the physical quality of his body's movement through space is in every drip and arc and puddle. The paintings are the record of a specific body in a specific state of creative intensity. And the intensity is real, and the records of it are real, and they are not going anywhere. He was also, by every account of everyone who spent significant time with him, genuinely frightening when drunk, which was frequently. He smashed things. He said things designed to wound, with the specific accuracy of someone who had read the people around him completely and knew exactly where the vulnerable points were. He could be tender and he could be devastating, and the choice between them was not made by any principle that the people around him could predict or prepare for. The art world absorbed all of this into the mythology of the tortured genius and presented it as the price of the paintings, implying that the paintings required the destruction, that the same force that produced the art produced the damage, and therefore the damage was a kind of collateral of genius, rather than a series of choices made by a person with enough control over his behavior to continue making art when he chose to. This is the most persistent and most damaging lie that the romanticization of the psychopathically configured artist perpetuates. The damage was not the price of the paintings. The damage was what happened to the people around him while he was making the paintings. The paintings and the damage coexisted. They did not produce each other. Let's complicate the opposite direction, because the discussion would be dishonest if it only moved one way. Vincent van Gogh is the most famous example of the tortured artist in Western culture, and he is almost always discussed in terms that romanticize his suffering and his ultimate self-destruction. He cut off his ear. He shot himself in a wheat field. He died poor and unknown. Van Gogh was, by every clinical indicator available through the historical record, a person with severe mental illness, most likely bipolar disorder, possibly with psychotic episodes, possibly with temporal lobe epilepsy. The exact diagnosis uncertain, and probably less important than the simple fact that he was in enormous pain for most of his adult life. He was also, and this part gets less emphasis, genuinely, extraordinarily generous, genuinely, deeply, emotionally connected to other people, genuinely concerned with the well-being of the people around him in ways that the psychopathically configured artist is constitutively unable to be. He wrote thousands of letters. The letters are, among other things, the most detailed and most emotionally honest account of the experience of making paintings that any painter has ever produced. He wrote about colour with a sensory precision that reads almost as synesthesia. He wrote about the people in the fields he painted with a warmth and a specific attention to their dignity that is entirely absent from the condescension with which most educated Europeans of his period regarded agricultural labourers. He cared about people. He felt things enormously and apparently constantly, and with an intensity that his nervous system was probably never designed to sustain at that level. He is in this article because the romanticisation of his suffering has been so comprehensive and so damaging as a cultural phenomenon that it deserves direct confrontation. Van Gogh was not a psychopath. He was a person with mental illness who made extraordinary paintings and who suffered genuinely, consistently, and ultimately fatally. The cultural narrative that transformed this suffering into a romantic prerequisite for artistic genius did enormous harm to subsequent generations of artists who internalized the message that the suffering was the source of the art, and that therefore they needed to protect their suffering, or perform it, or refuse treatment for the conditions that were producing it, because the suffering was what made them artists. Van Gogh would have made extraordinary paintings if he had been able to access effective treatment for his mental illness. The paintings came from his specific perceptual sensitivity, and his formal intelligence, and his extraordinary capacity for colour, none of which required the suffering. The suffering accompanied the art. It produced enormous additional pain for him, and for everyone who loved him. It did not produce the paintings. And the century of romanticisation that collapsed these facts into a narrative of necessary suffering in the service of genius is one of the more cruel and consequential myths in the history of Western art culture. Here is a thing that almost never appears in the biographies. What happened to the students? The great psychopathically configured painters were frequently also teachers, formally or informally, and the specific quality of their teaching had effects on the people they taught that ranged from genuinely transformative to genuinely destructive, sometimes in the same person across the same period. The psychopathically configured teacher is extraordinarily good at identifying what a student is actually doing, at seeing the formal problem beneath the surface of a student's work, at cutting through the student's defences and self-justifications to the actual quality of what has been made. This is a real gift. It is also delivered without the social padding that softens criticism to the point of uselessness, without the management of the student's emotional response that most teachers perform, because the emotional response affects the student's ability to receive the information. The psychopathic critique lands. It lands fully and precisely, and without cushioning, and it tells the student something true about their work that they needed to hear. It also sometimes breaks something in the student that does not reconstruct in the way that grows the work. The cases are documented across the history of ateliers and art schools. The student who encountered a specific teacher received a specific quality of attention and a specific quality of critique, and emerged from the encounter either transformed or diminished, or some complex combination of both. The teacher moved on. The student carried the encounter with them for the rest of their career. The relationship between the psychopathically configured teacher and the gifted but emotionally vulnerable student is one of the most volatile in the history of artistic education. The student wants to be seen, and the teacher sees them with complete accuracy and total indifference to the emotional cost of that seeing. And the seeing is both the gift and the wound. What the student does with the gift and the wound determines their career more completely than any other single encounter they will have. You get to decide what to do with all of that. The art world has been deciding to look at the paintings and bracket the rest, and this is one decision with real costs. Other people have decided to refuse the paintings on the basis of the rest, and this is another decision with real costs. The most honest position is probably to look at both simultaneously and refuse the comfort of a clean resolution. To let the painting be extraordinary, and the biography be what it was, and the distance between them be the specific and permanent discomfort of genuinely complex truths. This is what the art asks of you, in the end. The same thing the painter asked of their subjects, to be looked at whole without the softening that makes looking easier. The painter didn't offer that softening to the people they painted. The work doesn't offer it to you. The least you can do is return the favour.